Welcome to Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center, a podcast we do several times a week. And we actually are happy to announce that we are the Best of Bainbridge podcast this year, 2024. Kind of an honor of readers. And to do that, we also are now distributing the podcast not only on YouTube, but you can find it on Spotify and Apple iPhone audio version. So check that out. Also, thanks to Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island for sponsoring Something to Talk About. They offer independent living, assisted living, and memory care up on Rolling Bay. To learn more about that, including their day stay and respite programs, check out their website, fieldstonecommunities.com, or call 206-594-1010. Today, we have a couple of early childhood experts here to talk to us about great reading materials for adults to share with children around Martin Luther King and civil rights issues. And I really appreciate George Shannon and Allison McDonald for joining us. So I would love it if you might start off by either one of you by telling us a little bit about yourself and your experience with sharing the wonderfulness of literature with our smaller folks.
Allison, take it away.
Okay, well, hello, I'm Allison McDonald, and I teach preschool here on the island, but I also travel all around teaching preschool teachers how to do what we do. I have a website called notimeforflashcards.com, which is now almost 17 years old. And I know my son is now almost off to college, and I started it with him because I was bored at home. And one of the things that made that website really popular were my book lists that I put together for people. I would review the books honestly and do that. So I'm also an author, which is nonfiction. It's all for teachers. I don't have my books with me. I barely got out of the classroom ready for this. So let me just tell you, first of all, from an educational perspective. Wait, Reed, do you want us to go into our whole spiel now?
Oh, I'd like George to now introduce himself, and then we'll come back and talk about the books.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm George Shannon, and 2 years ago, I retired after 50 years of working with children as teacher, as children's librarian, as a children's author, and it's my world. So I'm happy to be here.
Great. And I really appreciate you both taking the time to share your expertise because it can be a little overwhelming. There are a lot of good and not good books available, and sometimes it's hard to make choices if we are not as familiar as you are with the literature. So, Allie, you can go ahead maybe and start to share some of the titles that you had thought you might pick out for.
So my absolute favorite book about Martin Luther King Jr. is this one, which is called Who Was Martin Luther King Jr.? And it's by Elizabeth Kaiser and art by Stanley Chow. Now, the reason I like this book so much and other books similar to it is because it starts with Martin as a young boy. So when we're teaching children about these great people in our history, start with their childhood because that's what they can relate to immediately. It's much harder for them to relate to a story about an adult than it is about a boy. My students today, when I read this to them and they're 3, 4, and 5, when they read it, they were like, wait, he's big now. He's not like us anymore. So when you start with him as a child, that really helps. So this is my absolute favorite one. I think I got it at Eagle Harbor actually. But this is my favorite one about him. But I think the main thing that I wanted to come today to talk about is that we can't do this in a silo. It can't be one book, one day. So we have to really make sure that we are spreading out, learning about unfairness, learning about what racism is throughout the year. And I have some great books about that. So today we read Our Skin. And it's a book all about racism. It really kind of explains the very, very basics of racism. Anti-Racist Baby is good, but it's really, I think this is better for home. So if this is for grandparents, this is a great book. It's by Ibrahim X. Kendi, who wrote, oh my God,
Stamped.
thank
Stamp.
you. Yes, exactly.
Yes, we read it as a BI Reads book, and many of our folks at the Senior Community Center participated in discussions. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of YouTube videos on this website about those discussions. So, Anti-Racist Baby is Ibram's book for kids, eh?
It is. And this one really is great for parents to talk about because it goes deeper than I'm able to do at circle time, basically. I don't have enough time to give this what it needs, essentially, but also to fill their library and throughout the year, go to the library with your grandchildren and find books like this, Little Legends. These are exceptional men in history. And it has, what I like about this is I would have, and my copy actually somehow got messed up, it's upside down. Which my students love. But it has all different exceptional Black men in history. And what I did with my own children is I would choose one person and have them choose someone we'd read it that night. So we wouldn't read the whole book cover to cover. That's too much to take
There are
in.
a lot of words on that page, I can see.
There are a lot. And I do want to tell grandparents, don't feel bad about skipping words sometimes. Once the reader with you can notice you're skipping, that's great. Then you say, great, you read it.
Yeah.
But until then, don't feel bad. Make sure it fits your readers. And so really another great book that gets overlooked sometimes is We're Different, We're the Same. It's a Sesame Street book. And it talks about all the different ways that people are physically diverse. So we don't want to shy away from calling out racism for what it is and explaining it in a child-centric way, but we also want to show the other diversities as well. So let's talk about race is one of my absolute favorites to use with children because it really breaks down what racism is simply, because if they don't understand why it was such a big deal that MLK said, hey, this is unfair, they won't understand why he's such a wonderful person and why we celebrate him to this day. So in my class, we started with the skin, and we've been talking about it all year as well. A lot of these books have been out all year, but we specifically read this, had lunch, then read this, and noticed really why it's so important to call out things that are unfair.
That second book, Who Was Martin Luther King Jr.? You started with Our Skin, and then you went to Martin's story.
Right.
And it kind of follows him growing up and his
does.
response as a boy and then a man to
It
racism.
does. So it follows him growing up. It talks about how he loved everyone. He went to church and was taught to love everyone, but not everybody was taught to love everyone like him. And then it starts talking about how things were unfair. And at this point, I normally say things are unfair. What is unfair to you? What if I said you couldn't do that because your skin is, and depending on the child asking, I might say lighter or darker than mine. Is that fair? And then it goes on to him. And I talked about sitting on the bus. The book doesn't, but I brought it up because kids understand stuff like that. I mean, they fight over airplane seats. Like, I get the window. No, I do. What if those were rules that were unfair? And so it goes on to protesting. And then it goes on to his I Have a Dream speech, and it gives a bit of it. And
Yes,
then,
he's much bigger there in those pictures.
yes, exactly. It actually says when he is bigger, it says he grew up. And so we talk about that. And then I followed this book with them making a self-portrait where they got to choose their little person and the color of skin. And sometimes it matched them, sometimes it didn't. And they glued on things to make their person. And then I went around the room and I said, I didn't say dream because to them dreams are like unicorns. I said, I have a hope to help my community. And they all chose different ways to help their community. So it went from giving cookies to neighbors, to making friends, to picking up litter for the mermaids. I mean, we have some 3-year-olds in my class, but
Yeah.
that's fun, getting the gist of it. So I think really, I just want to make sure that grandparents know that we have to give them context as well for it to matter, for it to mean something, because the way that children learn best is that we're building on prior. So don't think one year you read this and then don't do it again next year. Like, keep going, keep learning, and throughout the year, not just around his birthday, because that will build it. All those layers will build up.
And I like what you said about the idea. Now, maybe you aren't going to do I mean, maybe you are. If you have time, you could definitely do a little project of an art project that followed it. But
Mhm.
if you're just getting ready for bed or just hanging out, the idea of interrupting the story to say, what do you think about this? Or have you ever had an experience like this? Uh, Makes it so they can maybe people can connect their life story with.
Yes, and honestly, you need to interrupt stories. Parents and grandparents are always like, no, I just want to get through it. No, please interrupt. That's how they learn. There's a special word called dialogical reading, and we want them to read that way. We want them to connect it, because then it'll matter.
I'm
So
sorry,
don't feel
what's the
like
fancy word you just used?
dialogic reading is the dialogic, which just means it's a fancy word to say talk about what you're reading. But we want them to do that. So please do stop, interrupt, tell stories, ask about opinions, ask if that's fair or not, because they'll connect to it and they'll connect better to his legacy if we do that too.
Oop,
Go
Reed
ahead.
lost his voice. There we go. Yes, and to build on what Allison shared is that, to my way of thinking, there are more than maybe too many books right now that wag a finger and say, this is what you should know. And the great thing about literature for any person of any age is when you discover something, because when you discover it, then it's part of yourself. You own it. So those discussions when a child is starting to feel something or trying to figure out something, of course you want to talk about it. And it can even be a word, where'd it go? Too many books here. A wordless book like Brick by Brick, which simply shows somebody discovers a hole in the wall. Speaking of walls these days. But what do you do with what you discover? You discover others, and then you can build a bridge.
Oh, right. So it's a picture book with a wall that gets disassembled and reassembled as a bridge.
Bridge. Yes, and that's, to me, that's one of the things when it comes to Martin Luther King Day, we can focus on his life, which is important, but then all the ripples that come out from that. So that here's another a book that I grew up in Kansas and I was alive when it was the segregation went before the Supreme Court. But before that, there was a big issue in California with Hispanics. So it's Martin Luther King's efforts continue to improve lives, but it's not over. It's over and over and over again. And we
This
keep
book you're
widening.
showing is called Separate is Never Equal.
And it's the Sylvia Mendez and her family's fight for desegregation. Let's see, in California in the late 40s. So luckily, we keep widening that scope of who gets to be equal, who gets to be included. And for example, I think it was last year, there was a significant film that got lots of attention about Bayard Rustin. He was the man who made the March on Washington happen. It's famous for Martin's wonderful words, which can be found in this beautiful picture book, I Have a Dream.
And let's see, forward by Coretta Scott King.
Yes. And so you can go back to his words and find out that he was inclusive. He wasn't talking about just African Americans. He was talking about everybody to be welcomed in.
And certainly for Martin, economic equality and inclusion was as much a part of the story in many ways
Oh,
as race.
yes. And Bayard Rustin did so much for the March of Washington and civil rights, but at the same time, he had to stay in the closet. So these steps, the people that were going for civil rights and various things in the early 60s were still keeping women in dresses and shut in their own closet. So we keep widening and widening it. And one way we can, I think, contribute to this in a in a non-bombastic way, because we want it to become simply part of our world, is think about I've heard various people, celebrities, but they say, I never saw myself in a movie before. I can't. They go, the first time I saw a Black person in science fiction was when Whoopi Goldberg was on Star Trek. That was amazing to this person. And so when we can share on a daily basis books that demonstrate the variety and the diversity of people, and it's not even a topic. There are books that are about civil rights and apartheid and Jim Crow, but there are also books that just are about living every day.
So looking at a book that you might be thinking about and see how diverse the representation is in that book is a good thing to think about when you're picking out a book for a kid.
Oh, yes, and it's, on one hand, it's so significant to the child of color or whatever makes them feel different than the majority, but it's also so important to every child to get used to everybody is different and everybody's the same. One of my favorite books that I used all the time when I was still at the island school is Same, Same, and Different. And it
Same
literally
but
shows,
different. Just for those of you keeping
oh, I
records.
couldn't read backwards. Same, same, but different. But it's about a young boy in what I assume is the United States and his pen pal in India. And it's over and over again. It's, we're the same, at the same time we're different. And that's what, I think that's what Martin Luther King's famous speech was about. We're same and we're different. And that's what makes it so interesting to be part of the world.
Yeah, I like both of you had examples of books where there are a variety of different characteristics or expressions that might speak to that difference, which allows us to see that there's also a lot of similarities, and the stories of all those people in those stories are probably interconnected in ways that.
And there's something, I'm working on a project that I hope addresses this, but we always have this thing, especially with younger children, of which one of these is not like the others. Well, when are we going to start asking, how are all of these the same? Because it depends on what you're looking for. And we have been trained in a variety of ways to keep looking for how are we different, rather than how are we the same.
I wonder if Allie or George, you might be able to talk a little bit about, because obviously kids are going to feel comfortable or uncomfortable about talking about subjects that they're not quite sure how they fit. So, we said during our discussions on Stamped with adults, let's be forgiving of each other as adults and recognize we might say things that come out not the way we meant them, or we might make a mistake in the way we're talking. I'm guessing that also occurs when you're talking with young people who don't sort of, I mean, there is the issue of like, what have we already absorbed? But you're watching somebody try to absorb what makes sense now, right? Can you speak to that kind of challenge of kids trying out or trying to make sense of the differences and similarities?
I think so often we put our adult views and our adult judgments on it, when often, and remember, I'm talking about preschoolers, so they will notice differences, but they don't necessarily have the same baggage that we have with that difference. They might say, her hair looks like this. Like today, my hair is normally pulled back and I took it down. My students are being a little bit rambunctious today and I took it down. And one of them said, your hair is messy. And I said, it probably is messy. Like she was noticing it. Observations, most children at this age are making observations and they're not bringing the same baggage that we are with it. So like we were noticing skin color today and I was like, oh, mine is a little darker, mine's a little lighter. At no point did anyone in the group have any beyond absolutely just noticing the color. They weren't noticing anything else. So I think my main advice is just to try to truly look at it from their perspective. The last thing we want to do is make them think it's taboo. So when we like ban things, when we say, oh, we can't talk about this book, it has 2 dads. Like, no, that's normal for these children. Let's make it's normal. This is the norm. And we're not going to say, don't say that. It's like when a child notices another person is using a wheelchair and their parent shushes them. Oh, no. Well, that person is using a wheelchair. Yes, that person's using a wheelchair. It could be for a lot of reasons. We can politely ask and might be told it's none of our business, or that person might explain it to us too. We have to be ready for either one, but let's not put our baggage on them yet.
That's brilliant.
Let them the facts to start with.
Yeah,
So
I think about my grandson saying, well, why is your tummy so big? And his mom going, oh.
Right. Like we just say, oh, like my student saw a family picture of me, and Reed is friends with me on Facebook. And he knows my family from church. He may have seen I am a foot shorter than all of my children, all of my in-laws, everyone. It's like one of these things is not like right? And my students, I showed them, they said, why are you the kid? And I said, oh, that's interesting. You think I'm the kid because I'm the shortest. Well, and we got to so instead of shushing what they notice, instead try and figure out what they're really asking, and then that's the opportunity, that's the teachable moment to use. So that's my
George.
I'm always pleased when I've had different children, because I have 2 hearing aids, and one of my favorite all times was at a school in Seattle years ago, and this kid was, I have a question. And so we got to squeeze this guy's question in, and he goes, how come you got those big boogers in your ear? But then I get to normalize it by saying, I've got glasses to help me see you. I've got these hearing aids to help me hear you. And I want to see and hear you. And then it's like, it's not an issue. It just, that's the way it is. And we can move on quickly.
Right. But getting all defensive about it shuts you down. Susan, did you have a comment or question? You'll need to unmute.
George, I missed the title of the first book you presented to us, and I'm making a list.
And I
That
can
was the
email you a list too.
brick by brick.
Brick by brick.
Brick? Gotcha. Thank you.
So, all these insights are really valuable. Are there other things that you would like to leave? We're kind of focused on grandparents here, but any adults who are thinking about books with their kids, or kids that they don't know even, as well. And that's sometimes how we feel, especially if we're visiting kids who don't live right next door to us.
I would say one thing is, remember what you want to find when you read as an adult. You want to read a novel or even nonfiction that allows you to feel a part of it, that you can connect. And children want and deserve the same thing. As soon as you start to lecture me, I tune you out. But if you give me something that I can experience, then I'm in that car and I'm ready to go the distance. So children desire the same things adults do when it comes to stories.
And then I would say, and this is not just for this topic by any means, but please, when that child asks for that book 400 times, read it 400 times. because this is probably the number one question I get from anyone who's reading with small children is, oh, I hid that book. Don't hide the book. Don't hide the book. Rereading the same thing does multiple things for children. It creates security. They feel like they are readers well before they can read independently because they recognize the words. There's so many good things. It builds vocabulary. There's been wonderful studies that show that rereading the same book over and over actually has major literacy benefits. So when they grabbed that, and it was Maisie Cleans Up for me and Molly, my youngest, and it was a terrible book, but I read it in all different accents because she had to read it over and over. So please, I know that you can want to stab yourself in the eye sometimes by the 400th time, but just keep reading because that is really, really beneficial for them.
Great.
Yeah.
An idea about trying to take a meditative stance. It's like, I'm just going to be here for this kid for this hour. And so I'm going to absent myself from like, is this interesting to me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm very lucky right now. I've started volunteering at a island preschool 2 days a week. And no matter what's going on in my head, once I get there, I'm out of the picture. It's a different kind of mindfulness that and it's such a joy to truly just be there for them and responding to them and then having fun. I don't have to be a grown-up for 3 hours.
There you go. So thank you both very much, and I'll put a link to the on the video to the books that you mentioned. Really appreciate you taking the time. Very, very informative, and have a meaningful MLK Day.
Absolutely. You too.
Bye bye.